A few hundred years ago, the oceans were home to millions of whales. But then we found they were incredibly useful animals.
Every single minute of people's days would have been surrounded by whale products.
They would. Whales were simply seen as commodities to produce benefits for people.
For many, whaling conjures up images of Moby Dick or Japanese factory ships. But it's also an important and forgotten part of British history, carried on right up until the 1960s.
It was a way of life, and it was a respected way of life.
I discovered that whales became an essential source of food.
The whole of Western Europe was desperate for anything to eat.
And that a vast industry was created on the edge of the world. When industrial whaling took on the whales of the Antarctic Ocean, the centre of the business was on a British island. Here on South Georgia, I explore the extraordinary ruins of a complete whaling town.
I mean, look at the scale of this.
And I try to understand what it was like to live and work here.
You went away as a boy and you came back a man.
For decades, biologists had realised that whale populations were being put under extreme pressure.
So why did it take so long for the scientists' warnings to be listened to?
The situation was absolutely disastrous.
Knowing that whales were decimated, it's hard even to imagine the mindset that would want to kill them.
I wouldn't like to do it now, and I wouldn't do it now.
But if I really want to understand this important industry, I have to put our environmental guilt to one side and examine it through the eyes of its own time.
Why do people embark on this difficult and dangerous thing? What were the gains? What were they after? What were the dangers? What was it actually like to be a whale hunter?
Nowadays, I'm one of the youngest whalers alive. There won't be many of us left to tell the story about whaling. I think it should be done before it's too late.
This is the west coast of Scotland, and I've been coming here since I was a boy. Nowhere in Britain is more alive than this place. It's absolutely throbbing with the natural world. And the thing that they've relied on for their lives here has been the sea. And I've always known they've eaten limpets and obviously fish and shellfish, seabirds. But what I hadn't realised is that they also hunted the whale.
Until just a few hundred years ago, large numbers of whales of many different species inhabited these waters. And it's the realization that today's lack of whales must be the result of a long and sustained effort that has prompted me to find out more about whaling. It's a history that's almost been lost, but luckily many whalers recorded their industry, and some are still alive to tell their story.
It was part of our heritage. I mean, whaling had gone on since God knows when.
People had always done opportunistic whaling, eating, cutting up whales that washed up on the shore. But what I hadn't realised is that about 1,000 years ago, the Vikings arrived and began a completely different way of doing this, of actively chasing and hunting whales. I'm sailing to a place where the Viking approach to catching small whales was still being practiced less than 200 years ago. This is Stornoway Harbour in Lewis in the Hebrides, and I'm just coming into the harbour now. And I've read an extraordinary account in this book here by Osgood Mackenzie, a 19th century account of a pilot whale hunt. And what's fascinating is that they're doing exactly what the Vikings have been doing all over the North Atlantic for the last 1,000 years. So out here, there would have been one line of boats outside the pilot whales, with everyone in them throwing stones into the water, shouting. And so slowly, they drove them into this narrowing head of this loch, with the idea that when they get to the head of the loch, in the shallows there, they can jump into the water and slaughter them.
The oil from these pilot whales was invaluable to the people living here, providing lighting and oiling machinery, while the cured meat would help feed them through the winter.
So this is where it all ended up, right at the head of Stornoway Harbour in the shallows here. The whole of Stornoway was out here with knives, broadsaws, roasting spits, stabbing away at these things. And the blood was horrific. It's rather weird to think of all this killing going on in a town in Scotland, but in fact it was part of something that was going on all over the North Atlantic, the Viking North Atlantic. This was a civilization dependent on what the sea could give it, and the sea could give nothing better than the whale.
From the late 17th century, a more commercial form of whaling developed to supply the world's growing cities. The shift to a refined urban life created an ever-expanding market for whale products. I've come to Spitalfields in London, to a merchant's house that's been restored to how it was in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I'm interested to find out how much of what's in here was made of the whale. Callum.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Professor Callum Roberts is a marine biologist with a special interest in how our seas have been exploited over the centuries. Wow, that is a room, isn't it?
Certainly is. It's just like the inhabitants have just walked out the door.
Well, there's a classic whale product in here, isn't there?
That's right, the corset, which was supported by these stays inside the material.
Can
which
you feel
were
them?
made
Yes, you can.
of whalebone.
Is that whale oil that's burning in there?
It would have been at the time, because it became completely standard for people to light their rooms and houses with this kind of fuel. And out in the streets, by about 1740, London had 5,000 street lamps that were fueled by whale oil alone. And that's why there was such a surge in demand for whales.
Was there any feeling that somehow this wasn't quite right?
Not at all. Whales were simply seen as commodities that could be hunted to produce benefits for people. There was no sense that they were limited in number.
Ships from the ports of Britain, Holland and New England flocked to the Arctic in search of whales. In 1788 alone, 247 British ships set sail for the ice. There they chased down whales in light rowing boats with handheld harpoons. The most famous of all the whalers who went up to the Arctic was a man called William Scoresby from Whitby. And he wrote this account of whaling in the Arctic regions. Those employed in the occupation of killing whales, he says, when actually engaged, are exposed to danger from three sources: from the ice, from the climate, and from the whales themselves. And of the three, it was the whales that were the really dangerous things. Boats, together with their crews and apparatus, projected into the air. Christ.
Some of them must have been terrified. I mean, maybe they'd been capsized before or something like that, and you don't live long in either Arctic or Antarctic waters. You only have a few minutes. In the old days it was wooden ships and iron men. Now it's iron ships and wooden men. Well, there must have been iron men in these days to go out and open boats and harpoon whales.
So what effect did this huge demand for whale product have on the whales themselves?
The particular whales that they were after then were things called right whales. The reason they were the right whales is because they moved slowly, they were quite docile, and they had a big layer of blubber, which meant that after they'd been killed, they floated. And that was important because when you've got something as heavy as a whale on the end of a line, then if it sank, you'd be in trouble. And being so valuable meant that they were pursued relentlessly, so that after a couple of hundred years of exploitation, they essentially were driven extinct in the North Atlantic. And this is the wrong kind of whale. This was the blue whale. And these were also abundant in those waters, but they weren't hunted. And the reason was that they were too fast. They couldn't be approached by rowboats or in sailboats. But there's another important reason. If you were to harpoon one, it would sink, and that would be a major liability.
Okay, so the blue whales were uncatchable.
They were.
As the easily caught right whales in the Arctic were brought close to extinction in the mid-19th century, British whaling went into steep decline. The centre of the whaling world shifted to South Norway, where there was a drive to find a way of hunting the species that was still plentiful.
Small towns like this one in Vestfold became centres of innovation and engineering excellence. The question is, how did they do it when the rest of the industry was dying on its feet? The answer lies in this man, Svein Foynd, the inventor of modern whaling, who became the richest man in Norway as a result. And look at him, he's a great, fat, substantial, no-nonsense figure. But can one man really have transformed an entire industry?
I've been invited to Norway to join a group of the Scottish whalers. They're on their annual visit to meet their old Norwegian friends from the industry.
It's still quite mobile, isn't it?
They've brought me to a restored whale catching ship that illustrates Svein Foynd's technological revolution.
So what were the big changes that Svein Foynd made to whaling?
He invented the whale catcher. He invented a new type of whaling gun, which he made bigger. It's a harpoon with an explosive head on it.
And the system he invented lasted?
Yeah, still now. Yeah.
Foynd's bold idea was to harness steam power and modern explosives to allow him to catch the wrong whales, the blue and fin whales that swam fast and sank once they'd been killed.
Generally, I think the whales were mostly spotted from the barrel, about 70 feet above the deck.
When you were going up to the barrel, as the ship was rolling to one side, you just hang on. Once you got down there, you had binoculars and you started looking for whales. If I'm up in the barrel and I saw a whale, you just blew the whistle and you started pointing. Of course, as soon as you shouted, the catcher went full ahead.
The telegraph goes, I answer the telegraph, and then open up the valve, full.
For full on?
You were going then, you were on a chase. You could tell you were on a chase. You could see that everything was shaking, the whole barrel and everything was shaking.
If you had spotted whale, it might last for an hour, so the excitement would mount.
I'll tell you something, there's nothing more exciting than being on the catcher when it's chasing. When the whale goes down, you're all on your toes, looking all over the place. It's just exciting.
Once you got coming up to the whales, maybe about maybe 100 yards ahead of you, the gunner would leave the bridge and go to the gun. You did, well I did, you know, when a whale was harpooned, you couldn't help wincing when that harpoon went in, because that was a living animal. Just had feelings just the same as we do, as far as pain is concerned. Yeah, it was a brutal way of life. There's no getting away from the fact.
They seemed so friendly.
and they'd make a noise, and like when you hit them, they cried really, and that I felt that.
Foyne also developed a system to keep afloat the species of whales that sunk after they'd been killed.
We then had to pump air into the whale.
The mess boy's job was to take a long wooden pole and a hose with something resembling a huge hypodermic needle, and then pump air into it.
We then had to flag the whale because throughout the day we might be chasing for the next 8, 10, 12 hours. So coming back, we want to make our job a little easier to find them again.
You were a whaler for 30 years.
Yes.
And you became a gunner. You were a gunner in the end?
I became a gunner when I was 25.
And do you know how many whales you shot in your career?
Well, plus minus 6,000.
Really?
Yeah.
That is quite a body of whales, isn't it?
Oh yes, oh yes.
And the thing was to catch as many whales as you could. That was what we were there for, and that's what we concentrated on.
It takes being on a catcher like this to see just how good Sven Foyne's changes were, how incredibly effective they were. He changed everything. The second thing is what extraordinary teamwork's going on here. Everything has to be incredibly finely tuned in this very, very hostile, dynamic, dangerous environment. But there is some mismatch between that skill in the service of something that isn't entirely good. There's something that doesn't quite fit there. With Foyne's new whale-catching ships, the blue and fin whales along the coasts of northwest Europe could now be caught and towed ashore for processing. Modern whaling quickly spread from the waters of northern Norway to Iceland, the Faroes, and Scotland. The new catching technology coincided with a lull in demand for whaling products. Coal gas and then electricity had taken the place of whale oil for lighting, and no one wanted whalebone corsets anymore. There was some demand for whale oil, but the prices were so low that the enterprise would only work where the whales were really densely concentrated. It was then that whaling entrepreneurs remembered old explorers' reports of abundant whales at the other end of the world, the Antarctic Ocean.
I went whaling at the age of 16, coming off a croft in Shetland, and you went down to Aberdeen, you saw your first double-decker bus, your first train.
I had never been off the island before. I went to Leith and joined the Southern Harvester in South Shields and headed down to the ice.
With a history of whaling and a reputation as seafarers, Scotsmen became a part of the industry Norway pioneered and joined them in the south.
I chose whaling because it was an adventure.
For me, the long sea voyage is reduced to a comfortable 16-hour flight to a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands. Here, I join a ship taking 120 tourists on an Antarctic expedition cruise. This is taking me 900 miles across the Southern Ocean to what became the new centre of the whaling industry, another British island, South Georgia. There are fantastic albatrosses out here. Look at that. Oh my God, that's a beautiful thing. Oh. Whoa!
All my life I had wanted to see the Antarctic. I suppose this was my way of doing this.
The reason I wanted to go to South Georgia and Antarctica is that I had read from the age of 10 about Shackleton and Scott, and that fascinated me as a youngster.
In 1892, 10 years before the two great polar explorers, Scott and Shackleton, had set foot on Antarctica, two whaling expeditions from Norway and Scotland were already exploring this last frontier of the known world. They reported back there were thousands of blue, fin and humpback whales. We're just crossing the Antarctic convergence, which is the point where quite warm, relatively warm Atlantic water comes down and meets very much colder Antarctic water. As those two water bodies meet, there's incredible turbulence and upwelling in the ocean. And so it becomes very, very fertile. You get a lot of birds and also whales. If you were a whale hunter, this is where you'd come to hunt them. This is it. This is whale central. But there isn't a single one here. So we've arrived, this is South Georgia, and it is honestly one of the most dramatic places I've ever seen in my life. You know, out there, the wild Southern Ocean, the wind howling through these gaps here, these fantastic sort of sheared alpine faces of these mountains disappearing into the clouds, beaches over there with these giant elephant seals, albatrosses nesting all over there. God knows what's going on down there. This is kind of, you know, the earth as excitement, isn't it? Look at it. It's just, I don't think I've ever arrived at a place that feels sort of like this. It's just pumping. Lying outside the pack ice, South Georgia was better known than the Antarctic mainland. The first person to land here was the famous British explorer, Captain Cook, in 1775. At first, he thought he'd found the great southern continent itself. So here already, 6 young male elephant seals just lying out there on their own. But the really extraordinary thing is up here. Crowds and crowds and crowds of penguins. Isn't that fantastic? All the grown-ups in the foreground, and there behind, the hundreds and hundreds of little brown babies. It's like an army of hot water bottles standing to attention. My lift on the cruise ship is over.
Okay. Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Good luck.
I need to transfer to a new base so I can start exploring the remains of the whaling industry on the island. Our other ship is over there. That's the Pharos, which is the South Georgia Fishery Protection Vessel, where we're going to be spending the next few days exploring this amazing island. In 1904, the captain of the Norwegian recce a decade earlier, C.A. Larsen, came back to the desolate island of South Georgia and set up a prefab processing station. He found so many whales that his catchers never had to leave the bay and could rely mainly on the inquisitive, easy-to-shoot humpback whale. His gamble to find a densely populated hunting ground immediately began to pay off. The British Colonial Office was surprised to hear of this new venture set up without their permission. But spotting a source of tax in this wilderness, they first charged him for a belated license and then offered further licenses to others. I've woken up this morning in this incredibly beautiful bay. Some marvellous sort of alpine scene, sort of 3 Matterhorns on the horizon. And it has these other bays off it. And I know that somewhere in there, at the head of those bays, are some of the whaling stations that we're going to explore. So what I'm hoping for is whaler life in a kind of capsule over there.
I'm getting a ride ashore to the largest of the stations with a team who are surveying it for the government of this British overseas territory.
This is Leith Harbour, one of the biggest whaling stations here on South Georgia.
And it was made by a man called Salverson, who was living in Edinburgh, and he'd set up whaling stations in Shetland, in Iceland, and even over in the Falklands. But none of them were quite in the heartland of the whale, and that was South Georgia. And I think of the number of lives that are soaked into this place. And imagine what it was like arriving here as a young guy from Scotland.
Extraordinary. I mean, this is extraordinary.
Very excited to wonder what was going to happen, you know, what job you would get, how you would cope with it. We were just young boys. You had no idea what the future might bring for you.
Impressed by Larson's catches a few miles down the coast, the Salverson family were quick to apply for a license for this bay and started building in 1909. Leith Harbour, named after Salverson's home port in Scotland, was in use until 1965 and became the year-round hub of the company's entire Antarctic operation.
So this is it, Leith Harbour, in all its beauty and total dereliction.
Leith Harbour was a very, very busy place, and I was absolutely astounded by the number of vessels that were berthed there, ready to take part in the whaling industry.
So, landing prohibited. It's an offence to use any jetty, to land here, to approach within 200 metres of the station, all because of unsafe structures and asbestos. And that's by order of the government of South Georgia. Well, the only reason that I can be here today is that we've got special dispensation from that government, but under certain quite carefully controlled conditions. So I have to wear this suit, and if ever I enter a particularly sensitive and asbestos-rich building, no hat. I have to put on the hood, and I've got a mask which I would also wear, just so I won't die. Well, the whole place is just littered with junk. There's a forklift truck there. I think this is a giant lathe. Some kind of other machine-making tools there. So this is obviously kind of some metal worker's shop. And here they're huge stock of rods of all gauges and calibers. Oh yeah, it's absolutely stuffed. Wow, look at this. This is a complete preserved world in here. How amazing. Okay, so this is obviously the forge, the hot forge where they could make pieces of new iron steel equipment.
It's almost 50 years since the whalers left, and visiting naval ships and fishermen have ransacked many of the buildings.
It's very like a kind of Tutankhamun experience, this. The grave robbers have been in and have left the chaos and anarchy on the floor. But still, there is so much kit. Absolutely perfect time capsule.
The harsh weather here has also taken its toll. Before the buildings fall down any further, the South Georgia government has commissioned a highly accurate 3D survey of each of the stations.
Is it doing it now?
Yeah, so you can see, if you look over here, you see.
Okay. Okay, there it is. Oh, I see, okay.
Russell Gibb and his team
are using laser scanners to record the whole of Leith Harbour. But you're going to end up with a total snapshot of the whole place, the whole settlement at this one moment.
Yep. Yeah, so essentially what we're doing is we're creating an archive, a three-dimensional archive of the station as it stands today.
It's a melancholy place though, isn't it?
It is, very much so, yeah.
You do feel lives are in a way kind of soaked into the place. A lot of people's experiences and struggles and triumphs, they're all here, aren't they?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, you've got the graffiti. You probably haven't been down to the plant to see the graffiti yet. There's wonderful graffiti where people have been working here and they've left their names and the dates.
It's bloody noisy in here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it always like this when the wind's...
Yeah, as soon as the wind's up, you have loose iron everywhere, just bang, 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 clatter, clatter.
For the whaling companies, the gamble of investing in South Georgia coincided with a recovery in their market. Europe's growing industrial population needed ever-increasing quantities of hard fats for soap and food, and the supply from the American meat industry couldn't keep up. When a new invention called hydrogenation promised that cheaper liquid oil could be turned into hard fat, the demand for whale oil immediately started to rise. So this is it. This is the heart of the whole operation here. This is what they called the flensing plan, the place where they drag the whales in and chop them up. Now, this is not somewhere designed for some little cottage industry. I mean, look at the scale of this. You could fit 10 whales on here. Well, this is where the business begins, right at the sea edge. They would have caught the whales out there. The Southern Ocean is just past those headlands. Pulled them in. Probably if they caught a lot of whales, they would keep them on buoys out there. And then tugboats like these that are up here on the plan would pull them into this shoreline. They would haul them up this shallow slope onto the flensing plan. Flensing is the process of peeling away the whale's outer blubber layer.
As it's being heaved up, the flenser just stands there and lets the winch do the work, really. He stands there with the knife in the blubber. They were fantastic butchers, really.
You were pulling wires and that, so you had to be very careful. It could be a very dangerous job. So your attention had to be on your job all the time.
Steam winches extracted parts from the whale, and you had to make sure you weren't standing over these, otherwise you could be decapitated actually.
And this wire just sprung clear and it hit me right on the... Which side was it? It was this side. And it just whipped me right across the plan deck. Must have went about 25 feet, something like that. I could feel my heart going up, 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 and the side of the head was just swelling, like, you know.
Certainly health and safety was not invented then.
And this, I know, is the blubber processing plant. And somewhere they brought it inside to be chopped up into little pieces. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find that. I mean, oh, maybe here. Maybe here. There is a hole here. Oh yeah, with a chute going down there. So they slid the blubber down through there. So the blubber would have come in here, down underground there, and then there is this big elevator here, which so it rises up through the building. But you can imagine that just sloppily full of minced blubber. So it's a very intense process. Steam is being driven into these boilers under high pressure, and that steam blows the oil out of it, and it's not a kind of gentle, careful bubbling. This is, give me the oil. The oil in the blubber layer was easiest to extract, and so when they were faced with such abundance, the whalers simply left the rest of the carcass to float away.
So I think this is a film taken in the 50s.
I'm interested in what Russell and his team think about the activities of the station they've spent weeks surveying. Do you recognise that, you guys? Do you recognise that?
It's actually lovely to see these films of the stations as they were, compared to what we see them as now, where they're just, you know, sort of tragic ruins. Look at the volume of meat down there.
Flesh everywhere. It's unreal.
How do you not thought it was like that?
I thought it might have been more streamlined and animals pulled up and it's cut up and not. I didn't sort of think that there'd be flesh lying everywhere.
And you know what it was used for, but it's not till you actually see it in action that you go,
Really, it's
oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's brutal though, that's the thing. It's so brutal.
It's a sin. It seems like a sin, such a beautiful animal. And we're doing that, and man's doing that, you know.
By the 1910 to 11 season, Salverson's operation at Leith Harbour had become the largest whaling concern in the world, sending home over 8,000 tonnes of oil and paying their shareholders 100% dividend on their investment. In 1912, the same year that Scott reached the South Pole, there were 7 whaling companies up and running on South Georgia. An island entirely uninhabited 8 years earlier was now home to 1,200 men.
That was a piece of cake, really, you know. The only thing you missed is a woman.
Oh, look at these lovely girls. Fantastic. Oh, and we've got the real thing here. There's a lovely one. And La Parisienne. This reminds me of something I've got here, which is a letter from Tam to his wife. Probably one of the least diplomatic letters ever sent from South Georgia. Because he writes on the back of it, "Here I am sitting on Danny's bunk. Hope you like the pin-ups. Best love, my dear, from your Tam."
I'd say the camaraderie was terrific. And that's where you learn to do it. I mean, you've got to make a wee bit joke of life to survive times like that.
Of course, we used to still our own booze, which I shouldn't be telling you, should I?
If you're ever catched with any of that in your cabin or anything, that was your barred straight away. You'd never be back at the whaling again. And there was every chance that you were sent home in the first transport that called. So that was the punishment if you got caught.
Alcohol was a very prized commodity, I tell you that for nothing.
A night's booze like that usually took away a lot of tension. You know, it was kept them going for another long while.
Because I've got a photo that exactly matches this. They're making illegal hooch out of all this equipment. With the girls on their lockers, exactly like that. Isn't that fantastic? I think that's what this hooch business is all about, having a laugh. So you come in from the blood and guts out there, and at least in here, you can have a few girls on the wall, have a drink, have a good time, have a joke, have a smoke. Getting a brew on is what they called it.
You'd do anything for a tin of yeast. Yeast was the main ingredient.
Look at that. Best for baking, eh?
You didn't tell people where you hid that, you know, it was pretty secretive stuff.
Oh my God, and what about in there? There we go. This is the remains of a still in here. Oh, on here, under this bed. And something even better, that's the party scoop there. That's what you welcome your guests with. A cup made here.
By 1914, South Georgia was such a well-supplied outpost of the industrial world that Ernest Shackleton stopped here to restock at the start of his endurance expedition. Before he left London, prominent scientists were voicing concerns that the depletion of whales in the north was now being repeated down south. Keen to encourage a long-lived whaling industry, the government set up an interdepartmental committee to investigate.
The committee asked Shackleton if he could take a scientist with him to study what was happening to the whales down here. And so a young biologist called Robert Clark joined the expedition and came here to talk to the whalers. And from their figures, it appeared that the humpback in particular was in steep decline. From something like 5,000 whales in 1910, it had dropped to 474 only 3 years later.
The committee suggested a ban on the taking of humpbacks, but the stations had already moved on to blue and fin whales to make up their catch. Broader regulation required the whole carcass of the whale must now be used. This tallied with Salveson's thrifty ideals, and unlike the earlier Norwegian-owned stations that took just the blubber, Leith Harbour installed plants to process the meat and bone.
The meat came over here, and the way they did it was to haul it over to these giant bucket slides here.
My job was to take the guts out of the whale. It was not a bad job if you had a fresh whale, because you could warm your hands in the warm blood. But it wasn't a nice job when a whale was a week old.
For the work it was bloody. Bloody and hard work. And you go up the plant, and I can still picture it. There's a winch there, steam winch, and a green door.
Aha! He said, look for the green door.
Inside there's this big cylinder which is covered with asbestos.
So this is the great big cooker that Jimmy was talking about.
When there was a break in the whale, we used to get underneath the cylinder with our whaling boots on and all the oily gear and sleep.
This is where Jimmy used to have a kip under there. God. Can you imagine that?
When the First World War broke out, whale oil was in even more demand for the manufacture of nitroglycerine in explosives, and all regulation was dropped. The Norwegian companies found it difficult to operate during the war, and seeing an opportunity to steal a march on their rivals, Salveson's invested further in Leith Harbour.
Everything was used. There's nothing wasted.
You'd cut the jawbone off, cut the ribs out, cut the backbone out, and that's heaved onto the bone loft.
Ah, and there's a bone management area here. Yes, this is exactly it. Here is the saw. Oh my God, look at that. What a monstrous object that is. This is whale spine cutting machinery.
The bone sawman, he'd have two boys working with him. One chap for dragging out the hook, another chap for holding the saw, so it didn't whip back and forward too much. And it was boom, boom, boom.
Steam powered, jiggering its way through the bones and cutting them into 2-3 foot lengths, which they could then dump down into these pots here. And once the bone was in there, then the last of the whale was gone.
When I went to Leith Harbour and seen my first whale up on the plan, I thought, good God, what a size of an animal. Massive. And within about 20 minutes, there was nothing, the poor thing left. It's all chopped up into cookers.
They process whales like Ford-made cars. That's what this is about. Just absolutely unbroken route from ocean to oil tank. After the First World War, catches from South Georgia stations continued to climb, reaching their peak of nearly 8,000 whales a year by 1925.
At the time it was a job for me, and I was making more money than my father was making.
You looked at every whale as it came up, it became a number of pounds.
Salverson's profits were by now over £300,000 a year, equivalent to 100 million today. The gamble of establishing a complete industrial town on a desolate Antarctic island had turned out to be a very shrewd move. This is the industrial world brought south, and the only reason it's here is that out there are some of the most productive and nutrient-rich seas in the world. And that's what this pile of corrugated iron is all about. It's about parasitizing on the riches of the ocean. It is just a, give me your juices and I'll sell them. Why was a place making such huge profits simply walked away from and left to rust just 40 years later? And why was Britain still in the 1960s doing something that we now feel is so wrong? Imagine the number of whales needed to fill this. And nearly all of that oil going back to Europe to make margarine. A major innovation at sea produces a gigantic leap in scale, while an epic tussle between big business and science pushes the whales to the brink.
I think we all knew that time was up.
Well, the whales were gone, weren't they? They're gone.
A few hundred years ago, the oceans were home to millions of whales. But then we found they were incredibly useful animals. Every single minute of people's days would have been surrounded by whale products.
They would. Whales were simply seen as commodities to produce benefits for people.
I've seen how whaling became an important industry, beginning with hunts in Scotland and forays into the Arctic, before a British Antarctic island became the centre of a global enterprise.
The whaling industry in the Antarctic was by far the biggest fishery than there's ever been.
Now I discover how a breakthrough in ship design transformed the industry.
It's incredible what went on in these ships.
And why Europe became reliant on the whale as an essential source of fat.
Desperate. The whole of Western Europe was desperate for anything to eat.
And I continue to explore the world's largest whaling station to fathom why it was abandoned in the 1960s. There can't be another room like this in the world. An astonishing little capsule of late 1950s life. For decades, biologists had realized that whale populations were being put under extreme pressure. So why did it take so long for the scientists' warnings to be listened to?
The situation was absolutely disastrous.
I don't think we have the right to bring any species to extinction.
If I want to understand, I have to put modern environmental guilt to one side and see the world through the eyes of the time. Why were whales so valuable? And what was it like to chase them deep in the Antarctic ice What was it like to be a whale hunter?
Nowadays, I'm one of the youngest whalers alive. There won't be many of us left to tell the story about whaling. I think it should be done before it's too late.
The Antarctic Ocean in the mid-1920s. Whale hunting had moved on from using sailing ships and handheld lances to steam-powered catching ships and grenade-tipped harpoons. The industry was expanding thanks to a growing market for whale oil as a cheap alternative to animal fat for the soap and food industries. Whale stocks in the Northern Hemisphere had already been decimated, and a number of pioneering companies had turned to the last frontier of Antarctica instead. Some were operating from ships anchored in sheltered bays around the British-administered Antarctic Peninsula, but the world's biggest whaling centre had been established on the remote and uninhabited island of South Georgia, still a British overseas territory today. I've come to the largest of the 6 shore stations on the island.
So this is it, Leith Harbour, in all its beauty and total dereliction.
This whole site is officially off limits due to collapsing buildings and asbestos. And I'm only allowed here by special permission, and as long as I wear the appropriate protective gear. Leith Harbour had been set up by the Scottish-based company Christian Salvesen in 1909. The peak of productivity here was 1925, when over 16,000 tonnes of whale oil was sent back to the UK, equivalent to £30 million worth today. So why, just 40 years later, was this gold mine abandoned to the ravages of weather and ransacking sailors?
It's like it's been burgled.
The foundation for all this was the abundant whales of the surrounding Antarctic Ocean. A fleet of whale catcher ships were hunting up to 200 miles offshore before towing their dead quarry back to the station. Up to 29 tons of valuable oil could be extracted from each whale by putting its blubber, meat and bone through different industrial processes.
The whole whale, 80, 90 ton whale, could be dealt with in 20 minutes. Arriving from the sea, a complete animal, 20 minutes later, totally dispersed.
The whalers, initially Norwegian and increasingly joined by Scots, were using some serious industrial power.
You were pulling wires and that, so you had to be very careful. It could be a very dangerous job. So your attention had to be on your job all the time.
Steam winches extracted parts from the whale, and you had to make sure you weren't standing over these, otherwise you could be decapitated actually if you weren't careful.
And this wire just sprung clear and it hit me right on the... Which side was it? It was this side. And it just whipped me right across the plan deck. Must have went about 25 feet. Something like that. I could feel my heart going up, 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 and the side of the head was just swelling like,
Certainly health and safety was not invented then. There was knives everywhere, and big sharp ones too. The cutter came who wasn't a seasoned cutter, he was a cowboy really. And he started swinging with this flenching knife, The knife came out of his hand and flying over my head there. Took the beret off we used to wear black berets. Took the beret off my head. I was lucky. I could have chopped my head off that. That is the biggest fright I got.
Back in London, the Colonial Office had realised that the stations risked becoming too effective for their own good. While it welcomed the tax revenue from its wild Antarctic possessions, it feared a repeat of the overhunting in the North Atlantic. It had introduced licensing and a magistrate to control the scale of the stations and banned the hunting of the already overexploited humpback whale. But Leith Harbour was still processing up to 1,500 whales a season. The head of London's Natural History Museum, Sir Sidney Harmer, realised that the only way to rein in such profitable operations was to present the whalers with solid facts. But as very little was known about whales, Harmer pressed for a scientific investigation, funded by an increased tax on whale oil production. A legacy of this visionary programme still exists in Britain today. I'm here at the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton to see their brand new research ship, the Discovery. Harmer's committee bought Captain Scott's old ship, the original Discovery, for the first research voyage to the Antarctic in 1925. And with the whale oil tax flooding in, they were soon able to build a more modern successor.
To undertake research into the diet, habits and the migrations of the whale, the Discovery Committee dispatched the Royal Research Ship, Discovery II, into the Antarctic.
Hello, I'm Adam. Yes, nice to meet you. Professor Howard Rowe is a former director of the National Oceanography Centre. Will you show me?
I'll show you some of what's going on.
Yeah. His career began doing biology at a whaling station.
And here, there are cranes either side of the A-frame for handling equipment down here. Yes. There are bigger ones there with a heavy reach.
The Discovery investigations were hugely ambitious, ahead of their time in studying the whole Antarctic ecosystem and revolutionary in being funded by industry.
This is the winch system. It is the heart of the ship. So for instance, over there, you have 15,000 metres of tapered warp for trawling nets at depths.
Of it, 10 miles.
Yes.
Scientists deployed new devices and techniques to probe everything from microscopic plankton to the whales themselves.
And here on the bridge gate is the direct link with the Discovery investigations and the current ship.
Look at that.
That is the badge of the Discovery investigations from the 1920s.
This is some bridge, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, this feels like a nightclub. A few fundamental questions form the basis of the investigations.
How old were the whales? What did they feed on? How often did they breed? Where did they migrate to? They knew they didn't stay there all the time. How long did it take them? In order to be able to get some feel for the size of the whale population and the effect that harvesting this would have on it. The end game was always to prolong the industry as a commercially viable organisation because of the tax revenues they got from it.
Alongside the ship-based work, a South Georgia base was established, Discovery House. Biologists spent the whaling season taking samples from the carcasses brought in by the whalers.
We weighed the testes of male whales, we weighed the ovaries of female whales, we took counts of the corpus luteum on the ovaries that indicated how many calves the whale had had.
The Discovery investigations also attempted the first whale tracking system.
To start with, they had developed a whale mark like this. And you can see it has reward for return to the Discovery Committee. And they each had a unique number, 4219. And the whole thing was fired from a 12-bore shotgun. And you fire them in, and it sat there so that the surface was on the surface of the whale. The position where the ship was noted. The whale hopefully is caught some time afterwards at a different position. And when it is processed, the whale mark is recovered.
It doesn't look like it's got much of a grip.
Well, that was the problem.
Oh, right, because these are tiny, these little barbs here, aren't they?
Hundreds of these were fired into whales. Not one was ever recovered. And it was discovered that live whales are very capable of shedding nasty parasites and things that stick onto the outside. And in 1932, a new whale mark was designed. It's a long steel tube with a number on it and the information about the reward. The position where the whale was marked was known. The position where the whale was caught subsequently was known, and you would know for a certainty that the whale must have moved from point A to point B.
So the whole migratory pattern of the whales was found, the different species of whales was found by doing this?
Yes.
Mark number 1484. This was the oldest ever recovery. This whale mark had spent 28 years in a whale. It went right the way through the process, and it finally turned up in one of the meat meal boilers. And the man from the meat meal boiler came running out with it and was very pleased to show me it because he got a reward for it. This was the first proof that anybody had, real proof, that whales could live so long.
So there's no way you can know about the life of a whale unless you kill it.
Yes, sir.
And for the next step on that, to save whales, you have to kill them.
Well, in a sense, yes. The science of the large whales depended upon the whaling industry. These are not animals which you can get to grips with unless, unfortunately, they're dead. If you can imagine walking alongside an animal 70, 80 feet long, trying to sample it, this is not easy.
These animals had already been killed. They were there, so it was up to us to make the best use of them as we could.
The whaling companies didn't like the increased tax to fund the discovery investigations, but they had little choice. In addition to their stations on South Georgia, many companies were operating factory ships further south, in the bays of the Antarctic Peninsula, also British. These needed the sheltered water for the difficult procedure of butchering whales alongside, and so they too had to pay the British tax.
The Norwegians had an answer to this problem, which was to take one of these whaling stations and to put it on board ship. And the way to do that was to make a stern slipway, just like the slipway coming onto the plan here, and then to use the deck of the ship as the plan. Then take the big processing plants, the blubber plant, the meat plant and the bone plant, and put them down below under the deck, so that the ship became a completely self-contained processing unit which could go wherever the whales were.
The same machinery is crammed into a 16,000-ton ship. It didn't have no room whatsoever to do anything. You're crawling between pipes and up ladders.
It was hot as hell, and you're always looking for water to drink.
It's incredible what went on in these ships.
The stern slipway was a revolutionary leap for the industry. By being able to process whales at sea, the new factory ships could follow their fleet of catchers to wherever the hunting was best. This was called pelagic whaling, and also allowed the industry to escape regulation. The British only controlled the seas up to 3 miles off their territories, beyond which the entire Antarctic Ocean was fair game. The seeds were sown for the industry's self-destruction. As well as the station at Leith Harbour, Salverson's had 2 old-fashioned factory ships operating in the Antarctic bays further south.
Very nice office. Nicest room in the whole place. Then a young manager visited Leith Harbour, Harold Salverson, the first of the family ever to make it down south. He'd been a lecturer in economics at Oxford and had got fed up with that. And the family were trying to persuade him to join the firm, and so he came down here to see what was going on. He began to apply all of those new, rational, systematic, technocratic ways of looking at how to run a business. And he wrote some marvellous letters home. It looks for the present as if a normal or even a poor year in the ice could pay handsomely. And later on he wrote, the fishing won't of course last for a long time. The more new factories and especially whale catchers are sent down, the shorter will it last. But possibilities and probabilities are so colossal at present that I cannot conceive of a well-managed, well-equipped factory failing to pay handsomely if sent down the next season or even for the following. He wanted Salversons to bank on these pelagic whalers. He wanted to make money just as the Norwegians were. The first thing that Harold did on his return to Britain in 1929 was to buy 2 liners and convert them into factory ships with stern slipways. He also ordered 13 powerful new catcher ships. This modernisation of the fleet cost nearly £700,000, over 100 million at today's costs. Harold also knew that demand in Europe was rapidly increasing. The hydrogenation of whale oil had just been improved to produce a spreadable, entirely tasteless fat, allowing more of it to be used in food. By 1933, 37% of the fat in British margarines was from whales. In Norway, I visited the Sandefjord Whaling Museum to find out the impact this expanding market and the new ship technology had on whale catches. So these are the international whaling statistics in the years before the Second World War. And they're putting in the numbers of whales that they're catching every day. And giant animals, 84 feet long, 77 feet long, one of them pregnant. It says here it had a 9-foot fetus in it. And the very interesting thing about it is that before those big technological changes of the mid-1920s, very few whales are being killed. This is the total width for 1920 to 22, a slim volume. But then, after factory ships were introduced in the late 20s, things start to expand. And so by 1930 to 31, you're up to this. You know, this is a measure of the vast number of whales that were being killed that year. Meanwhile, the Discovery investigations were starting to learn some important facts. The greatest concentration of the whale's food, the tiny crustacean krill, was to be found at the Antarctic ice edge. By the 1931 season, 3/4 of Antarctica was surrounded by factory ships and their catchers, all unhampered by any regulation. But when the season's record haul of whale oil caused the market to crash, the industry realized that some control was necessary. The 2 major whaling nations, Norway and Britain, agreed to restrict themselves to 2/3 of that bumper year, around 28,000 whales a season. Even with the catch limit, Salverson's investment in their modern factory ships was paying off handsomely. Over the decade of the 1930s, they posted a profit of £1.1 million, equivalent to 365 million today. Leith Harbour remained an active whaling station during summer, and over winter, it became the service centre for Salverson's fleets of whale catchers returning from the ice.
When the season ended, there was a possibility of you staying in South Georgia and overwintering. That was when all the whale catcher repairs were done and they were all made ready for the next season.
They were well fed, and I do know that. It was quite an attractive proposition
being out of the country over a year, you got all your tax back, so they came home with a fairly hefty pay packet.
My payoff was £1,100 for 18 months then, so that was a lot of money at that time. You could bought a house for £600, £700 at that time.
Maybe get a new fishing boat built or go into some sort of business. And there's quite a few businesses in Shetland today that were started on money earned at the whaling.
Without whales to be flensed, the whalers that overwintered had more time to enjoy the island.
The big events was the skiing events. You had the other stations coming in and joining in, like you see.
I thought, I think I'll get into the ski jumping. I liked watching this.
Danny Morrison, but Danny was a good skier. He made more of it than me.
And I've got a photo here of the ski jump here at Leith Harbour, and I think if you come just about over here, I think we must be pretty well at the bottom of the jump here, because here is a picture of a man in full flight. So I think the jump itself must be just up there. Well, there is something collapsed here into this little valley. I wonder. I think this is it. I think that is the deck of the jump itself, which of course is snowed up in the winter. And maybe even there is the kind of starting gate there, that top framework there. Yeah, so I think this is it. This is actually the Leith Harbour ski jump. How exciting is that?
The jump starts and we're up the top until the bugle blows.
And they set off down here, roaring downhill as fast as they could.
You're heading down at one hell of a rate and you're all off balance. You're trying to get your balance.
Whoa!
Before you know it, you're on takeoff. You must get past the big flat part or it'll be like falling off a 2-storey building.
And this is where you land, or the bit of slope you hope to get to.
As long as you got onto the downhill, when you fell, you just rolled, which is what happens. But my next jump was much better.
It was pretty good. It was pretty good. Danny was pretty good, eh? I think Danny was related to a penguin.
By the mid-1930s, whale oil had become an essential part of Europe's food supply.
Wow. Look at this. Look what the wind can do here, just folding in the whole side of the tank like that. When it was working, this tank, like the others, filled to the brim with whale oil. Imagine the number of whales needed to fill this. And nearly all of that oil going back to Europe to make margarine.
As the Second World War approached, several nations realized they needed to secure their own supply of this vital fat. 7 new factory ships were commissioned by Germany and 4 by Japan. Britain and Norway had lost control of the industry, and by the eve of war, Antarctic catches reached 46,000 whales in a season, blowing apart their attempt at regulation a few years earlier.
So this is the gun that the whalers were given by the government to defend South Georgia during the Second World War. But it was a hopeless old thing. Yeah, rather amazingly, is a shell. That went in there, I guess. Don't know, I've never done this before. And off it went. Really nothing happened in South Georgia during the war. All the whaling ships were taken away from here.
the factory ships to work on convoy duty, bringing supplies across the Atlantic, because the government thought that that was more important than getting whale oil, and the catchers to work as minesweepers. And so the people who were left here were really left with nothing to do. And the idea that they could have popped off at some German cruiser coming here with this old thing was, of course, laughable.
As the war approached its conclusion, Britain was desperately short of food, including fats.
We were absolutely on our knackers.
The hull of an aircraft carrier was given a new use halfway through being built.
It became obvious to the government that aircraft carriers were not nearly as important as something to get some bloody food into Europe. The importance of a whaling factory ship overtook that of an aircraft carrier, and therefore Balena was converted into a whaling factory ship.
So urgently was her catch needed that the finishing touches to the factory machinery were added after she sailed.
The Balena belonged to the British firm Hector Whaling, while Salversons launched 2 purpose-built factory ships of their own. Scientists and some whaling bosses realised that if the industry wanted a long future, there couldn't be a return to the 1930s free-for-all. In 1946, the International Whaling Commission, or IWC, was established to bring together industry leaders and scientists, including the Discovery Investigations biologists based at London's Natural History Museum.
Delegates to the IWC negotiated a quota for the number of whales that could be caught each year. And the figure they set was 2/3 of the catch before the war. And that was 16,000 blue whale units a year, which meant they could catch 16,000 blue whales, or their equivalent in the smaller whales.
1 blue was considered equal to 2 fin whales or 6 sei whales. Many IWC scientists realized that this quota was too high to be sustainable. But unable to justify anything lower to a Europe desperate for fat, they reckoned it was better than no quota at all.
Ooh, feels very James Bond in here.
I'm being allowed a sneak view behind the scenes with collections manager Miranda Lowe.
Fantastic. What are they?
Well, what you can see here in the jars are a lot of the oversized fish collected on various scientific expeditions.
They're really mysterious, though. I mean, how old are these things?
Some of them are over 200 years old. Some of the specimens were collected by Charles Darwin.
This building also stores a large proportion of the specimens from the Discovery Investigations, established in the 1920s to find out more about whales.
We're in the crustacea collection, so we're passing through the mysids, the amphipods, isopods, and we're going to eventually get to euphorsids.
Ah, these are the krill then?
These are the krill, exactly. And we have cupboards full of the Discovery Investigation krill.
Look at that, it's jar after jar after jar. Every single one of them hauled up. More cupboards here.
And we have more cupboards here. And it keeps going on.
I mean, if you think of the months and years of people's lives that are poured into these jars.
A massive investment, but it provides scientists with a huge amount of baseline data that they can use to compare to more recent research.
The scale of sampling was vast, and you might have thought that the data from it should have provided the scientific basis for sustainable whaling. But the industry didn't want any reduction in quota, and they soon found a way of sidelining the scientists by claiming that not enough biology had yet been done to prove that a reduction in quota was necessary. And so they sent the scientists off to do yet more biology.
A lot of emphasis was placed on getting more data.
But it's not data that's involved, it's methodology. It's to know what to do with the data.
While the biologists were kept busy collecting, the industry could continue to chase the large globally applied quota.
Oh my God, look at that, look at that! Oh, fantastic! Wow.
The catcher ships found that they were in a race, as every company tried to bag as much of the allowed total for themselves.
Sometime a couple of boats would sight whales and it was a race to get to them, to be the first there.
It's obviously something built for drive and power. It's got a whopping great prop on the back there.
If there's another catcher, you're shouting down the engine, we need a bit more speed. There's someone racing us here. You didn't want to put up a smoke signal because other catchers in the distance, of course, a puff of smoke told them you've increased speed.
There's something like 14 factory ships down at the ice at the same time, with each of them having 14 to 15 whale catchers, so you begin to get an idea of the size of the competition. There was radio connection between the factory ship and catchers, because obviously they would need to inform them what whales had been shot.
It was all in code, so that the other people couldn't listen in to where you were fishing.
If there was a lot of whales in one particular area, certainly the last thing you wanted to do was to advertise at the competition.
The race meant that companies invested in ever more catching equipment, and the whole quota could be caught in as few as 60 days. With so much money being pumped into the industry, no one wanted to reduce quotas to more sustainable levels. Meanwhile, Salveson's average profit through the early 1950s was running at around £1 million a year, equivalent to 73 million today. Leith Harbour continued to be the nerve centre of their whole Antarctic operation, and some of the money went to improving life for the whalers.
Ah, look at this. It's the film archive. There's a reel and miles of dumped film. Oh wow, there it is, there's the projector. How amazing. With a film case there. You can just imagine that noise, that wonderful cinema noise it made.
They would show pictures maybe 3 times a week, something like that. But after the first 3 months, then you're starting to see them all over again. So.
What the hell was it? The Quiet Man? It could have been the Quiet American, was it? John Wayne. And I thought it was terrific. And I saw it 16 times down there.
So this is the cinema. There's the projector room at the back there.
So that was quite a highlight, you know, the films, 3 nights a week.
So here we go. 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. The Prisoner of Zenda with Stuart Granger and Deborah Carr. The Last Time I Saw Paris with Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, you can just imagine them all gazing longingly into Elizabeth Taylor's eyes or cleavage. Huge, huge up there.
By the late 1950s, the price of whale oil was falling. It was being replaced by vegetable oils as the preferred fat for soaps and margarine. Also, the effects of a quota set way above any sustainable level for 15 years was plain to see.
Well, I think we all knew that time was up. You were not getting the catches that you used to. There was nothing left. We're going down there for the season and hunting for ages for our fish. You couldn't see them. But the first year I went down, they were all round you. They were everywhere.
In 1961, Salveson saw that Leith Harbour was losing money and decided to run down the station and scuttle some of the catches. Meanwhile, some countries were trying to make the most of what was left down in the ice by increasing the scale of their pelagic fleets. Japan bought the Baleina from Hector Whaling, and the Soviet Union launched the largest whaling expeditions the Antarctic has ever seen.
There's that many people down there, there's that many factories were down there. The Japanese, the Russians, South Africans.
A push at the IWC for a more realistic quota had merely resulted in the breakdown of the existing system, and the number of factory ships in the ice reached 21, supplied by 270 catcher ships. So why had the scientists not stopped this happening? I went back to London's Natural History Museum to ask Professor Howard Rowe.
Howard.
Hello, Adam.
How are you? Lovely to see you. This is the place, isn't it, where whale science, the sort of heart of whale science, was being done in the 50s and 60s.
Yes, more or less underneath our feet was the old Discovery hut.
Why did it take so long for the science, all the investigations they were making, actually to impinge on the industry?
You could not hope to persuade the whaling industry or any regulatory body without the basic data to support the argument, which was, after all, exactly why the Discovery investigations was set up. It was set up to provide the data which would allow regulation, and that is exactly what it did.
In the end?
In the end. It took until the late 50s, early 60s, before the group of scientists began to encompass specialist in population dynamics by the appointment of Radway Allen, Doug Chapman, and Sidney Holt.
Basically, we're bringing what we now call mathematical modelling from the fisheries world into the whaling world. Biologists have been collecting information, measuring the whales, looking at their ovaries, see how many babies they'd had and that kind of thing. But none of those scientists had any what we call numeracy. And it was that skill that we brought to bear on the data that the biologists had been collecting. Tucked in their office drawers, all this stuff about reproduction rates and things like that. So the first thing we did the first 2 years was to assemble it all, put it on punch cards. And as soon as we looked at the data, we could tell that the situation was absolutely disastrous right within a year. The blue whales were very close to extinction. The fin whale, tiny fraction of what it had been.
This is the earplug of a fin whale. Just the core end of it. The outer casing goes all the way to the outside.
And how big would that be?
And it might be 3 feet long, 4 feet long.
Really, that
in a big
much
whale.
ear wax?
Yes.
We couldn't, at the time, tell the ages of the whales. And being able to say how old a whale is crucial.
This is the important bit. This is where the tympanic membrane goes, and that creates this inner core, and it creates alternate light and dark layers. The light-coloured layer, which is full of fat when they're feeding.
It's the krilly layer.
Yes. And the dark layer in the subtropics when they're not feeding.
Breeding.
A pair of layers equals 1 year in the life of whales.
That is exactly like a tree.
It is exactly like a tree.
A winter and summer
Yes.
ring. So what was the effect of that discovery on the way people understood whales?
Well, it gave the statistical people, the modelling people, a firm basis on which to base their statistics if they know the absolute age of the animal through its life cycle.
We'd done our work in such a way that it was extremely difficult to criticise it. The science was so overwhelming, they couldn't deny it. We said that the blue whales they should stop killing anyway.
and reduced the blue whale units, as they were, to a quarter or a fifth of what they had been.
So why did industry accept that things had to change? Was it the science or was it money?
It was a combination of the two. It recognised that the science was becoming harder and harder to argue against. It also knew perfectly well that the numbers of whales were falling, so it was economically much less profitable to send whaling fleets to the Antarctic.
And if you had to choose between those two factors, economics and science, which was the more powerful?
Sadly, economics.
By the time Sidney and his colleagues released their damning report on whale stocks, Salverson's factory ships were making a loss.
We're sending in these factories and all these men and no catching fish, so therefore he wasn't making any money.
Well, the whales are gone, weren't they? They're gone.
Aware that the writing was finally on the wall, Salverson sold their factory ship quota to the Japanese, bringing centuries of British whaling, including 55 years in the Antarctic, to an end.
You were sorry to see a way of life go that you enjoy, but you understood why. And I think, along with every other whaler, would say they were glad that we pulled back from the brink.
After British whaling had ended, the IWC quota available to the remaining countries was drastically reduced, although more slowly than the science recommended. The hunting of blue whales was banned in 1966. With new science and anti-whaling campaigns,
Please stop killing the whale.
the taking of fin and sei whales was banned in the 1970s. Finally, in 1986, the IWC declared a moratorium on whaling, until a time when a sustainable approach could be guaranteed. Japan, Norway and Iceland continue to hunt whales, predominantly the small, more plentiful minke whale. In total, over 1.6 million whales were killed in the Antarctic. So where does this leave their populations today? Ecologist Mark Cowardine has an up-to-date picture.
In some species, humpback whale, for example, southern right whale, they seem to be doing pretty well. And some of those populations are increasing as fast as theoretically possible. So they're doubling every 10 years or so, which is fantastic. Other species, blue whale being perhaps the most frightening example, doesn't seem to be bouncing back at all. We don't know exactly how many there are, maybe somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 worldwide. And it may be that they're spread out so thinly that there aren't enough to actually build the numbers back up. So although we stopped whaling in the nick of time, literally the 11th hour before the biggest animal on the planet disappeared altogether, it may still be that it doesn't make a comeback.
Leith Harbour's working life didn't quite finish with the end of British whaling. In the mid-60s, Salversons leased the station to a Japanese company to produce whale meat, a high-value dish back in Japan. But after 2 years, even they couldn't make it pay, and Leith Harbour was finally abandoned for good. Responsibility for the ghost town has now reverted to the government of this British overseas territory, who are in the process of working out just how to manage this decaying but unique industrial relic.
It's 50 years now since Salverson's last expedition came back from the Antarctic. It's now history.
Of course it should be remembered. It happened, it was necessary, it happened, and you can't deny history.
In one way, the whole history of whaling in the 20th century is just a business story. There was a huge market in Europe. Companies came out here, got the whales, and serviced that market, and made a huge amount of money in doing that. But of course, it's far, far more than that. The people who came whaling did that with enormous skill and courage and enterprise.
These were, for me, the greatest memories, and I would love to go back down there and just see it all again.
Right, further over, Gregor, come on, you can do it.
I'm very proud to have been a whaler. Very, very proud indeed. It was part of British life.
The cost was really enormous. Over 1/3 blue whales, nearly 700,000 fin whales. And all for what? To make margarine and soap.
I don't think we have the right to bring any species to extinction, and we did stop just in time.
I'm glad it's finished, you know, because it was pretty cruel when you think about it.
It's deeply ambivalent, this story, and I can't really resolve that. And I think that what I feel in the end is that I very, very much admire the whalers, what they did, the courage they did it with, the skill they did it with. But I really, really hate the whaling.
All I can say is, I don't want whalers to be forgotten.
That's good.